Welcome to our lecture number 7. We're going to be discussing some of the key elements of Darwinian theory, namely natural selection. Darwin plays a key role in all of this, and we want to make sure that we understand some of the concepts that Darwin was talking about in his theory. So the key concepts that I want to try to get across to you, first of all, this whole idea of proximate causation. When we talk about proximate causation, and those are the things that I think psychology is historically has been most concerned with. It's those immediate kinds of day-to-day influences, things that are occurring in the environment, changes that occur in terms of the social experiences that we have, cultural experiences that we have, and so on. In other words, it's the immediate impact of those stimuli upon us. That's what we call proximate causation. There's also what we call ultimate causation. And in ultimate causation, we're talking now about what occurs over, hundreds, millions of years in terms of all these pressures that can occur, environmental pressures that can occur, for example, that may be as important, if not more important, than those immediate day-to-day kinds of factors. So again, it's the long-term influences over many years. Now, Charles Darwin first started out by exploring this whole idea of artificial selection, that is, breeding for a particular desirable characteristic. And there are, many different examples of this. Darwin worked with pigeons, homing pigeons, and found that when he bred the most successful pigeons, males and females that were very good in terms of this homing behavior, that is taking them, releasing them at a point distant from where their home was, that they could find their way back quite easily. What he found was that if he took males and females that were very good at this, then their offspring got even better. And then he would do this over many generations, and what he found was that they progressively got better and better and better. This is something that we call artificial selection. Artificial selection occurs all the time in the cattle industry, for example, breeding the beefiest cattle with one another to produce even beefier, better tasting cattle. This is something that is historically has been done in order to produce meat that's going to be even more flavorful and even tastier. We also see artificial selection in terms of horse racing. If a horse is one or two or even three legs of the Triple Crown, the Kentucky Derby, the Belmont, and the Preakness, those horses become extremely valuable for mating purposes. A male, for example, that has one or two or even three legs of the Triple Crown for stud services, the owner may charge several $1,000,000. So indeed, artificial selection is something that's been around for a long time, and Darwin really is one of the first individuals to begin to explore this. But even more important and more interesting to Darwin was this whole idea of natural selection, that this is something that organisms do naturally. And in any given population, some members are going to produce more offspring than are other members of that population. So when we begin to take a look at this Darwinian concept of natural selection, what we're talking about is the ability to survive, to adapt to change, and to produce more offspring. Offspring that are going to live longer, offspring that are not going to have health problems. So when we talk about natural selection, then this is what Charles Darwin's talking about. He's saying that this is something that is always occurring in any population. And again, developing a characteristic that allows that individual to survive and to adapt to change, to adapt to changes in the environment. It's going to allow it to live longer. It's going to allow it to produce more offspring. Though that is something that is happening naturally in all populations. So Darwin also talks about the concept of reproductive success. That's the ability really of an animal to produce offspring. That's how we go about defining it. That's how we go about defining reproductive success. It's the number of living offspring that you actually produce relative to other members of your species. How many are they producing? Are you producing more or less than other members of your particular species? So again, that's how we go about defining reproductive success. Individuals are compared with other individuals within that particular species. If you're producing more, they're more viable, they live longer, then that is obviously a good thing in terms of defining your reproductive success. Darwin also talks about variation. Variation is crucial. There's variation in terms of physical characteristics, variation obviously in terms of behavioral characteristics. If you take a look at members of any species, take a look at the human species, take a look at the people that you encounter every single day. We're not all the same. There's tremendous variation that takes place in our physical characteristics, like our height, like our skin color, like our hair and hair color, all kinds of changes in terms of physical characteristics, but behavioral characteristics as well. How sociable are we? How emotional are we? How intelligent are we? Tremendous variation that occurs. And of course, Darwin asks the question, what is responsible for that variation? And clearly, there's two primary things, our genetic background and our environment. These are not things that Darwin initially knew in terms of genes. It was not until later on that we had this piece of the puzzle that Darwin didn't really, fully understand. So variation, another key concept in Darwinian evolutionary theory. And then there's competition. We're always competing in any species. We're competing for scarce resources. We're competing for food. We're competing for mates. We're competing for territory. Darwin says that this is inevitable in any species, that this competition is occurring. So we have these two key concepts then, this whole idea of variation and this concept of competition. Again, two very important theories that Charles Darwin advanced. So there are misconceptions about evolution, and I want to make sure that everybody understands these misperceptions. Certainly, one of the other major theorists in this area was a philosopher and scientist by the name of Lamarck. And Lamarckian evolution is the idea that it's use or disuse of a structure that causes an increase or a decrease in behavior through inheritance. So he's really talking about inheritance. So we would see these giraffes who are eating from these trees, from the tree tops, in order for them and future generations to be able to do this. What he's saying is that through inheritance, the necks are getting longer and longer. And again, it's a use it or not use it kind of phenomena. That is what is being inherited. Charles Darwin is very different in terms of what he advances. What he says is that it's natural selection that accounts for this. These beneficial characteristics are being passed down as a consequence of the reproductive advantage that is produced by it. That's what's being passed down, is this reproductive advantage to future generations. So indeed, these are, contrasting views that are being taken here in terms of Lamarck in Darwin. And again, it's this natural selection process that Charles Darwin is advancing, whereas Lamarck is advancing this idea of inheritance being the most important thing. No, Darwin says it's really what is giving you a reproductive advantage in terms of being able to produce more viable offspring. When we take a look at the evolution of the human, and I think that this chart that you see here is a very instructive one, we are able to derive this by way of examination of fossil records, as well as the study of the human genome. We got our start about 3.5 million years ago, Australopithecus that we see right here. Then Homo habilis that you see here. Now we have a larger brain, more powerful hands. We're engaging in tool making, for example. And then Homo erectus. Homo erectus roughly 1.6 million years ago. That again, an even larger brain. These are individuals that are standing even more upright. They're using things like fire. Tool making is becoming even more advanced. Hunting big game. These are all very important changes, evolutionary changes by way of natural selection that's occurring. And then we have Homo sapiens, roughly 200,000 years ago. This is intelligent man, or what we call Neanderthal man. They're even more skilled in terms of hunting, even more skilled in terms of tool making, clothing, and importantly, passing down cultural rituals from one generation to another generation. So what we're seeing now in terms of this evolution, we are seeing some very important changes that are occurring in terms of natural selection. So natural selection is favoring two very important adaptations. One is bipedalism that we see here. Instead of walking on four legs, now we're just walking on two. And equally important, this whole idea of what we call encephalization. What we're seeing is an enlargement of the brain, in particular in the forebrain that you see right here. Again, take a look at these dramatic changes that are taking place in brain size. If we go from Australopithecus to Homo erectus to Neanderthal man and then Homo sapiens, now you're seeing these deep convolutions. And again, growth in these areas that are principally responsible for higher cognitive processing. So Homo sapiens developed a larger brain. More of our brain volume is being devoted to these higher cognitive processes of thinking and reasoning and decision making. Again, here's Neanderthal man that you see here. Here's Homo sapiens that you see here. Take a look at this enlargement that takes place in the prefrontal cortical area of the brain. Okay, very important. So now language is developing. We're living longer. We're passing down information, important cultural rituals, for example, from one generation to another generation. Again, we have these very complex cognitive functions that are evolving. We can now anticipate future events. We can engage in planning. So a greater level of sophistication is occurring in terms of the brain and the capacity of the brain. So there's some fundamental questions really that have driven psychological inquiry. Again, historically, we've already talked about the mind-body problem. How much of our behavior is psychological and how much is physiological. Can we separate those two things? Also, how much of our behavior is a product of nature and how much is a product of nurture? These are questions that have really driven psychology for a very long period of time. And I think that it's important to revisit some of these things as we go along. So, we talked about the mind-brain or mind-body problem, and there's still many lay people who believe that there's this psychological category of human behavior that really exists outside the human brain, that it transcends the human brain. But there's a lot of evidence that argues against that. For example, when we take a look at complex psychological functioning that can be severely compromised by brain damage or by stimulation of the brain. What we also know is that in non-human species, some possess abilities that were once thought to be purely psychological and therefore purely human. But when we begin to take a look at some of those non-human species, we begin to see that there are these advances that have taken place in their brains that allows them really to engage in this higher level of psychological functioning. So one of the things that I want to explore with you are some fascinating experiments that have been done in the whole area of what we call self-awareness. And when we take a look at this concept of self-awareness, I think that what we're talking about really is our ability really to reflect upon ourselves, to recognize ourselves, to realize that we are really separate from the environment and from other individuals. That's what I think that we commonly refer to as self-awareness. And indeed, that is something that we believe separates us from lower animals. But one of the things that scientists have been discovering is that certain infrahuman primates, like chimpanzees, for example, may possess this capacity for introspection and self-awareness. And indeed, there's some fascinating work that has been done with dolphins as well that suggests that they possess that particular characteristic. One individual who has contributed a great deal in this area is the scientist that you see here. His name is Gordon Gallup, who developed something that's called the mirror test. And it was his belief that self-awareness could be explored in infrahuman animals like chimpanzees by way of this mirror test. Can an animal recognize, for example, that it is himself or herself in a mirror when they look at a mirror, or do they treat it like another animal? Can they become the object of their own attention? And again, some fascinating explorations of this, and Gallup has developed this mirror test that has been used now very extensively to explore this in a variety of different species. If you take very young children, maybe a year of age or so, and they look in a mirror, they will think that it's another person. And if you take a chimpanzee, for example, they will look at it and treat it as another person. Indeed, they'll try to attack it. But after a few days, what they start to do, after, again, constantly being exposed to this mirror, is they start to inspect parts of their body, and they start to groom, and they start to make faces in the mirror, which suggests that they're now treating it not as another animal in their species, but now it really suggests that they're the object of their own attention. And indeed, Gallup believes that this is evidence of awareness. So he created this very interesting test of this, where he took these chimpanzees and he would anesthetize them, and they would paint this on their brow, right above their eye, this red paint, which was colorless, odorless, was not something that was an irritant. And when they woke up, he would expose them to this mirror again. And in this photo, you can see that the chimpanzee is reacting to that bright red odorless dye, and they're, inspecting it, looking at it, knowing that it's a part of their own body. So indeed, he believes that this test is one that really separates individuals that are human or have human-like characteristics, and chimpanzees have been discovered to possess this particular characteristic. It's interesting work, and it's work that I think ultimately has positioned us to try to understand what our behavior is a product of. And I think that this flow chart that you see here is one that many behavioral neuroscientists would be very happy with. So we start out in terms of our evolutionary history. These influences are being passed down from generation to generation by way of again, this whole idea of natural selection. So again, each individual then has this distinct genetic background that's influencing your neural development. That is interacting with the kinds of experiences that you have. That's influencing the development of your nervous system. Again, this is a consequence of experience that you have. It's a consequence of the environment that you are exposed to. And each individual's behavior and their capacities, their tendencies, their predispositions are really determined by that neural activity as it is interacting with the experience that you're exposed to. And indeed, this is reflected in your behavior, it's reflected in your thoughts, it's reflected in your feelings. Your behavior then is a product of this experience. It's a product of the situation that you are exposed to, whether that be a social situation or some kind of environmental situation that you're exposed to. And your success as an individual in your particular species is going to be a product of all these things that are occurring, and those genes ultimately that are going to be passed on to future generations. So indeed, our behavior is a product of genes, which is a product of natural selection, the experience that we're exposed to in terms of the environment and the social experiences and cultural experiences that we have, our perception of the situation as it exists and as it's ongoing. So our behavior then influences the likelihood of genes that are ultimately going to be passed on. So I think that if you take a look, at this flow chart, I think that it'll be helpful in terms of understanding, what our behavior is a product of. So we'll move on, to some more work in this area in terms of trying to understand the degree to which genes are influencing our behavior.